June 15, 1944, Normandy. A German artillery battery fires 12 rounds toward British positions near Hill 112. The gun crews move with mechanical precision. Elevation adjusted, recoil absorbed, shell casings ejected. Within seconds, the section chief orders displacement. They have done this drill hundreds of times. Fire, limber up, relocate before enemy counterbattery arrives. For 5 years, this method kept them alive, in Poland, in France, across the vast plains of Russia. German artillery doctrine assumed one constant: the enemy would need time. 15 minutes was considered safe. In 1940, that assumption was correct. But on this day, in Normandy, the American shells arrive in less than 5. The first incoming round lands just beyond the tree line. The second strikes the gun pit directly. Within seconds, high explosive shells blanket the position. The battery is erased before the last German shell lands on its target. Every gun destroyed, every crew member killed or wounded. No warning shots, no gradual adjustment, no time to move. They did everything right. They followed the book. The book wasn't fast enough. To understand why, we have to rewind 5 years. In 1939, artillery coordination was slow everywhere. Whether German, British, Soviet, or American, a multi-battery strike required voice relays, manual calculations, and sequential ranging shots. A forward observer would call in target coordinates. Each battery would compute firing data independently, using printed tables. Corrections were passed back and forth. The process could take 30 to 40 minutes before full fire concentration was achieved. Counter-battery response times were even longer. Artillery was deadly, but it was methodical. German doctrine, refined during the Blitzkrieg campaigns, emphasized flexibility and rapid displacement. Shoot and scoot became a survival instinct. Crews trained to dismantle and move within 15 minutes because intelligence suggested that was the average time an enemy needed to identify their position, calculate range, and respond. Against Poland, France, and early Soviet forces, this margin worked. German gunners could fire, relocate, and fire again with relative impunity. But by 1944, the battlefield had changed in a way most German officers did not fully grasp. In Normandy, the Americans were no longer fighting as inexperienced artillerymen. Since 1942, the United States had transformed its artillery doctrine through institutional reform. Instead of allowing each battery to operate as a semi-independent unit, they centralized computation inside a fire direction center. One location calculated firing solutions for multiple batteries simultaneously. Data flowed in, solutions flowed out. Radios replaced runners. Standardized procedures replaced improvisation. Every battery trained to use identical methods, meaning any unit could integrate instantly into a larger fire plan. The key was not the gun. The standard American 105mm howitzer was reliable, but not revolutionary. The transformation was mathematical and procedural. When a forward observer reported coordinates, those numbers entered a centralized system. Within seconds, firing data was computed and transmitted to every gun assigned to the mission. Multiple batteries could respond as one organism. And then there was sound ranging and flash spotting. American artillery units deployed specialized teams whose sole task was to locate enemy guns the moment they fired. Microphones measured the time difference between the sound of discharge reaching different sensors. By triangulating those differences, technicians could calculate the origin point of the enemy battery. Radar systems, such as the SCR-584, added another layer by tracking shell trajectories in flight and projecting their source backward. The moment German guns fired their 12 rounds on June 15th, they revealed their position. In earlier years, identifying that location would have required additional confirmation and slow plotting. By 1944, The data was fed directly into a coordinated response network. No delay, no debate. Within moments, firing solutions were calculated and transmitted. What made it lethal was synchronization. Instead of bracketing a target with ranging shots, American doctrine increasingly emphasized immediate massed fire. When the German battery opened up, American guns were already prepared to answer. Within under 5 minutes, dozens of shells were on the way. German crews never heard the gradual approach of ranging fire. They experienced a sudden wall of explosions. Survivors from other batteries later described it as if the Americans had been waiting with guns already aimed. In a sense, they had. By mid-1944, American artillery units in Normandy were firing more rounds per day than entire divisions had in 1918. Yet volume alone does not explain the shock. The real weapon was time compression. The Americans reduced the kill chain from detection to destruction to a fraction of its former length. 5 years ago, such speed would have been unimaginable. German officers began noticing the pattern. Interrogations after the Normandy campaign recorded repeated complaints. American counter-battery fire was unnaturally fast. Positions once considered safe for 15 minutes were lethal within 3 to 5. The old safety margin had evaporated. The tragedy for the German gunners on June 15th was that their doctrine was not wrong, it was simply obsolete. War had accelerated. Communication networks, centralized fire control, and rapid computation transformed artillery into something closer to instantaneous retaliation. The German battery believed they had 15 minutes. In reality, they had less than 5, and perhaps only 3. On that Normandy hillside, the shells that destroyed them were already airborne before they finished packing their equipment. Their displacement drill, perfected over years of war, collided with a system designed to erase delay itself. This was not about bigger guns, it was about speed. And once speed became the decisive factor, survival depended not on how well you executed yesterday's doctrine, but whether your enemy had already rewritten the clock.
In 1940, no army on Earth could coordinate massed artillery fire in under half an hour. Even the most advanced forces relied on a chain of voice commands, handwritten calculations, and battery-level independence. Each artillery unit solved its own firing problem. A forward observer would call in target data. A single battery would compute elevation, deflection, powder charge, and fuse settings using printed range tables. Corrections came slowly. If multiple batteries were involved, the delay multiplied. By 1944, the United States Army had reduced that process to minutes, sometimes less than 3. The transformation did not begin on the beaches of Normandy. It began in classrooms at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, home of the United States Army Field Artillery School. Before the war, American artillery officers conducted a brutally honest assessment of World War I. They concluded that firepower had been overwhelming, but coordination had been inefficient. Batteries functioned like individual musicians without a conductor. The solution was not better guns, it was centralized control. The innovation was called the Fire Direction Center, or FDC. Instead of each battery computing its own firing data, a centralized team of trained specialists handled the mathematics for all assigned guns. Observers in the field transmitted target coordinates via radio. Inside the FDC, personnel plotted those coordinates on firing charts, applied meteorological corrections, calculated ballistic solutions, and instantly distributed the final commands to every battery involved. Standardization was the quiet revolution. Every artillery unit trained to use the same procedures, the same terminology, the same mathematical steps. A battery from Texas could integrate seamlessly with one from Pennsylvania. Interchangeability meant scale. Scale meant speed. By 1943, American divisions in North Africa and Italy were already experimenting with rapid multi-battery missions. Lessons learned there were refined further before the invasion of France. Radios improved, training intensified. Forward observers were drilled relentlessly to deliver precise grid coordinates under pressure. Fire direction officers practiced solving problems against the clock. Accuracy was important, but speed became sacred. German doctrine emphasized decentralized initiative. American doctrine increasingly emphasized centralized computation. When German artillery fired in Normandy, American sound-ranging units immediately began triangulating the origin point. Flash spotting teams visually tracked muzzle blasts at night. Radar systems such as the SCR-584 detected shells in flight and calculated back to their source. That information flowed directly into the FDC network. There was no waiting for confirmation from multiple headquarters. The data arrived at a single node designed specifically to process it fast. Inside an American FDC tent, the atmosphere was controlled chaos. Large plotting boards covered tables. Transparent overlays displayed friendly and enemy positions. Teams of enlisted technicians and officers moved with practiced rhythm. One received coordinates, another plotted them, a third calculated range and deflection adjustments, a fourth transmitted commands to multiple batteries simultaneously. Every movement was procedural, every step rehearsed. The genius of the system was that it removed hesitation. No individual battery commander had to decide whether to participate. The FDC assigned missions instantly. Guns that had not fired moments earlier could be ordered to respond without delay. This created something no other army had achieved at scale: immediate massed fire. In earlier wars, artillery concentration required physical proximity. Guns needed to be grouped together. By 1944, American batteries spread miles apart could strike a single target as if they were side by side. The FDC synchronized them. Distance no longer slowed coordination. German officers began to notice that whenever they fired, the response was not random. It was concentrated and precise. Interrogation transcripts after the Normandy campaign include repeated references to American artillery being unexpectedly rapid and systematically coordinated. The Germans had excellent guns. They had experienced crews. What they lacked was the centralized computational engine that turned detection into destruction in minutes. The Oklahoma classrooms had solved a problem most armies did not even recognize as solvable. At Fort Sill, instructors emphasized that artillery was a science. They treated firing data like equations to be optimized. Meteorological reports were integrated daily. Wind speed, air density, temperature, all factored into calculations. Calibration was constant. Training never stopped. By the time units reached Europe in 1944, they were not improvising under fire. They were executing rehearsed mathematics. The difference between 15 minutes and 5 minutes may not sound dramatic in civilian life. On a battlefield, it's the difference between survival and annihilation. The German battery on June 15th believed they had a safety margin built on 5 years of experience. They did not realize that somewhere in Oklahoma, years earlier, officers had quietly redesigned the architecture of artillery warfare. They replaced independence with integration. They replaced sequential calculation with simultaneous computation. They replaced delay with discipline. And once the system was fully operational in Normandy, it operated with ruthless efficiency. The Fire Direction Center did not need to shout. It did not need to inspire. It simply processed information faster than the enemy could move. When German guns fired, they triggered a chain reaction already designed to respond. Coordinates flowed in, solutions flowed out, shells followed. The revolution was invisible. There was no dramatic new weapon unveiled. No massive technological breakthrough captured headlines, yet this procedural innovation compressed time itself on the battlefield. And when time shrinks, doctrine collapses. By the summer of 1944, American artillery was no longer reacting slowly to enemy fire. It was punishing it almost instantly. What began as chalkboard theory at Fort Sill had become a combat system capable of destroying an artillery battery before its crews even finished packing their equipment. The classroom had become a weapon. By the summer of 1944, American artillery had evolved beyond fast response. It had mastered synchronization. The technique that would define this transformation carried a deceptively simple name: time on target. On paper, the concept looked straightforward. Multiple batteries, sometimes miles apart, would fire at different times so that every shell arrived on the target at exactly the same second. In practice, it required precision that bordered on mathematical choreography. Before this innovation, artillery typically announced its presence. A battery would fire a ranging shot. Observers would watch the impact, call corrections, and adjust. The enemy, hearing the first explosion, had seconds, sometimes minutes, to dive for cover or begin displacement. Even massed fire came in waves. The sound of incoming shells built gradually. Time on target erased that warning. To execute it, fire direction centers calculated not only distance and elevation, but time of flight. A shell fired from 10 kilometers away might take 30 seconds to land. Another fired from 5 kilometers might take 15 seconds. Instead of firing simultaneously, each battery fired at a precisely assigned second so that the shells converged together. The farthest guns fired first, the closest fired last. The result was a single, devastating impact window, often within 3 seconds. For the soldiers on the receiving end, it felt instantaneous. No ranging shots, no buildup, just sudden, overlapping detonations. The mathematics behind it was unforgiving. Meteorological data had to be current. Wind speed, air density, barrel wear, propellant temperature, every variable influenced flight time. A miscalculation of even 1 second could stagger the impact and ruin the effect. American artillery units trained relentlessly to ensure those variables were accounted for. FDC personnel performed rapid time-of-flight calculations under pressure, assigning each battery an exact firing second. When executed correctly, dozens of shells from separate units struck at once. In Normandy, this method shattered German counterattack formations. During Operation Epsom in late June 1944, British and American forces faced fierce resistance near Hill 112. Elite SS Panzer divisions attempted coordinated armored thrusts to reclaim ground. German doctrine relied on momentum: advance quickly, concentrate armor, break through before enemy artillery could organize. But time on target disrupted that rhythm. Forward observers positioned on elevated ground or in light aircraft identified assembly areas and movement corridors. Coordinates flowed into the FDC network. Within minutes, multiple battalions were assigned to the mission. Batteries positioned miles apart adjusted their clocks. At the designated second, they fired. The impact was not gradual. Survivors described the effect as walking into an explosion already in progress. Vehicles were hit before dispersal could begin. Infantry caught in open ground had no time to dig in. Tanks, vulnerable on their thinner top armor, suffered from airburst shells detonating above them. German after-action reports repeatedly noted the shock of concentrated artillery arriving without warning. In earlier campaigns, they could anticipate fire adjustments and relocate. In Normandy, they found themselves struck before their observers even identified incoming rounds. The psychological dimension was as important as the physical destruction. Traditional artillery gave troops a moment of dread, a whistle, a buildup of impacts. Time on target removed that anticipation. It created the illusion that the enemy had perfect knowledge and perfect timing. American commanders understood that artillery was not merely about destruction, it was about paralysis. A synchronized strike froze movement. Units hesitated to assemble. Counterattacks stalled before they fully formed. By mid-1944, U.S. artillery units in France were firing tens of thousands of rounds daily, yet volume alone did not explain their dominance. Other armies could fire heavily. What they could not replicate quickly was synchronized massed impact across dispersed units with minimal delay. The system depended on clock discipline. Units synchronized watches constantly. Fire missions included exact timing commands down to the second. Communication networks had to function without interruption. If a battery's watch drifted, the convergence failed. Precision in something as mundane as timekeeping became lethal. German doctrine still emphasized rapid displacement. Shoot and scoot assumed the enemy needed time to calculate and organize response. But against time on target, even a 5-minute reaction window could be fatal. A battery identified by sound ranging might face not gradual counterfire, but a sudden simultaneous strike from multiple battalions. The margin between firing and being destroyed shrank dramatically. There was also a logistical advantage. Because American artillery relied on centralized coordination, it could mass fire without physically massing guns. This reduced vulnerability. Batteries could remain dispersed and concealed while still participating in large-scale strikes. The Germans, accustomed to more localized coordination, often had to group guns more tightly to achieve similar effects, increasing their exposure. Time on target represented the full maturity of the fire direction system. Detection, computation, communication, synchronization. Each element depended on the others. Remove one and the system slowed. Together, they compressed decision-making into minutes. For German gunners in Normandy, the effect was disorienting. They faced an enemy that did not telegraph its blows. When they fired, American counter-battery often arrived before displacement was complete. When they assembled for counterattack, artillery strikes erupted without preliminary adjustment. War had always rewarded firepower. Now it rewarded timing. The difference between shells landing 5 seconds apart and shells landing within 1 second was not just technical, it was tactical. 5 seconds allowed men to drop, to scatter, to react. 1 second did not. By the end of the Normandy campaign, American artillery had established a reputation among German forces as the most dangerous threat on the battlefield, not tanks, not aircraft, artillery. And at the heart of that reputation was a simple principle refined into a weapon. If every shell arrives together, the enemy has no time to survive the first before the rest follow. Time itself had become calibrated, measured, weaponized, and once synchronized down to the second, it was devastating.
Speed and synchronization meant nothing without vision. Artillery could calculate faster than ever, but it still needed eyes on the target. In Normandy, those eyes often came from an aircraft so slow and fragile that it looked harmless. Fabric-covered wings, a small piston engine producing barely 65 horsepower, no armor, no heavy weapons, yet German troops learned to fear it more than many fighters. The aircraft was the Piper L-4 Grasshopper, the military version of the civilian Cub. It could fly low, slow, and steady. It could land in fields barely longer than a road. Most importantly, it gave American artillery something revolutionary: continuous real-time observation from above the battlefield. From a few thousand feet in the air, a trained artillery observer could see what ground units could not: gun flashes hidden behind hedgerows, armored columns forming in tree lines, supply vehicles moving along narrow Norman roads. Equipped with a radio, The pilot observer transmitted grid coordinates directly into the fire direction center network. There was no relay through multiple headquarters, no delay for written reports. The moment something moved, the system knew. German commanders quickly realized that whenever one of these small aircraft circled overhead, artillery fire followed. Not random fire, precise fire. Unlike high-speed fighters or bombers, the L-4 did not roar past and disappear. It lingered. It orbited patiently. Its slow speed was an advantage. It allowed the observer to adjust artillery rounds in real time. A shell would land slightly long. The correction would be transmitted immediately. Within seconds, the next salvo would strike closer. The aircraft acted as a floating extension of the fire direction center. German anti-aircraft crews tried to shoot them down. The L-4 had no armor protection. A few machine gun rounds could destroy it, but its small size and low altitude made it difficult to track. And even when hit, observers often continued transmitting corrections until the last possible moment. For troops on the ground, the sight of that small plane circling meant they had already been seen. One pilot became legendary, Charles Carpenter, later known as Bazooka Charlie. A former history teacher, he attached bazooka rockets to the wing struts of his L-4. Officially, the aircraft was meant only for observation. Carpenter pushed beyond that role. In France during 1944, he attacked German armored vehicles from the air, firing rockets at close range. Though the rockets were limited in power, the psychological shock was enormous. German troops were not accustomed to being hunted by what looked like a civilian trainer aircraft. But Carpenter's story, dramatic as it was, represented only one facet of the aerial observation system. The real impact came from coordination. The L-4 did not operate alone. It was connected by radio to artillery battalions spread across miles. When an observer spotted a column forming for counterattack, coordinates were transmitted instantly. The fire direction center processed them. Batteries assigned firing times. Within minutes, sometimes less, the sky above the target filled with converging shells. This integration turned information into immediate destruction. German armored doctrine relied on assembling forces before striking. Tanks required coordination, infantry support, and timing. Assembly areas were crucial. But assembly meant concentration, and concentration, once observed from the air, invited artillery. During the fighting around Hill 112 and throughout the Normandy campaign, German units attempting to regroup often found themselves under sudden, concentrated fire before they could disperse. Survivors described the pattern repeatedly: a small plane overhead, followed shortly by devastating artillery. The Americans had created a closed loop: observation, calculation, fire, no break in the chain. The L-4's simplicity was part of its genius. It required minimal maintenance. It consumed little fuel. It could operate from improvised strips near the front lines. While faster aircraft needed prepared airfields and complex logistics, the Grasshopper operated almost anywhere. That flexibility kept it close to the action. By contrast, German forces struggled to maintain similar levels of real-time aerial observation in Normandy. Allied air superiority restricted German reconnaissance flights. Without persistent eyes overhead, German artillery relied more heavily on ground observers, which limited visibility in the dense hedgerow terrain. The Americans, with aircraft continuously scanning from above, often saw first and fired first. Technology alone did not guarantee success. Training completed the system. Artillery observers underwent rigorous preparation to estimate distances, identify targets, and communicate concisely under fire. Radio operators drilled constantly to maintain clarity and speed. Every second saved in transmission reduced the enemy's survival window. The battlefield became transparent to those who controlled the air at low altitude. For German soldiers, the psychological burden grew heavier. Even when no artillery fired immediately,
The presence of the small aircraft signaled vulnerability. Movement became dangerous. Concealment became temporary. The sky itself felt hostile. Artillery had always depended on observers. In earlier wars, balloons filled that role. But balloons were stationary and vulnerable. The L-4 brought mobility and persistence. It could track moving targets. It could adjust fire continuously. It could relocate quickly if threatened. The result was a battlefield where German units could be detected, fixed, and struck in rapid sequence. Firepower and synchronization meant nothing without vision. The Grasshopper supplied that vision. By 1944, American artillery was not just fast, it was informed. It did not fire blindly, it fired with confirmation. And once the small aircraft overhead began to circle, the countdown had already started.
By late summer 1944, the pattern was unmistakable. Whenever German artillery fired, American counterbattery followed with unnerving speed. Whenever armored units assembled for counterattack, synchronized artillery disrupted them before momentum could build. The system, detection, centralized calculation, time on target, aerial observation, was functioning at full maturity. But no weapon system is invincible. Every enemy studies defeat. After the collapse in Normandy and the retreat across France, captured German generals were interrogated. Officers such as Heinrich Eberbach openly acknowledged the destructive efficiency of American artillery. They did not describe it as merely heavy, they described it as fast and coordinated beyond expectation. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt similarly noted that Allied artillery and air coordination made maneuver increasingly costly. The Germans had faced powerful artillery before, in World War I, on the Eastern Front, but not a system that compressed reaction times so dramatically. German adaptations began immediately. Greater emphasis was placed on camouflage, deeper entrenchment, and even shorter firing sequences. Some batteries attempted single salvo displacement, firing minimal rounds before relocating. Others moved guns into urban areas or dense forest cover to complicate sound ranging. Yet these measures only reduced vulnerability. They did not restore the old 15-minute safety margin. The American network still shortened the kill chain. Then, the war moved to the Pacific. On Okinawa in 1945, American artillery encountered a different kind of enemy, one that had studied the fate of German forces in Europe. The Japanese 10th Army understood that assembling in open terrain invited annihilation. Instead of large counterattacks across exposed ground, they constructed layered defensive systems. Extensive tunnel networks, reinforced caves, and reverse slope positions shielded artillery from direct observation. Guns were often hidden within cave mouths and fired briefly before retracting deeper into cover. The Americans could still detect firing positions, but physical destruction became more complex. A time-on-target strike against a cave entrance might seal it temporarily, yet crews inside could survive. The system that had devastated mobile formations in Normandy now faced fortified depth. On Okinawa, American artillery fired in enormous quantities, hundreds of thousands of rounds over the course of the campaign. Counter-battery radar and sound ranging continued to function effectively, yet the Japanese adaptation demonstrated an important truth. Speed alone cannot overcome an enemy who refuses exposure. The system remained lethal, but it had to be combined with infantry assaults, flamethrowers, demolitions, and direct fire to eliminate deeply entrenched positions. Even so, the Japanese never defeated the system. They survived within it. They endured bombardment through concealment rather than outmaneuvering it. Back in Europe, as Allied forces advanced into Germany, American artillery maintained its dominance.
The centralized fire direction center concept scaled upward. Entire corps could mass fire across multiple divisions. Guns dispersed across vast areas could converge on a single objective. Logistics supported sustained barrages at a level few armies in history had achieved. Yet one of the most striking stories of this system involves a senior American officer who voluntarily stepped down in rank to participate directly in combat command. Major General Orlando Ward had previously commanded an armored division, but was relieved earlier in the war. Later, rather than remain sidelined, he accepted reversion to colonel in order to return to frontline leadership. For some officers, rank symbolized status. For Ward, command in combat mattered more than stars on a shoulder. His decision reflected a broader institutional culture: performance over prestige, effectiveness over ceremony. The artillery system that emerged from Fort Sill and matured in Normandy was not driven by individual heroics alone. It was driven by organizational discipline. Officers and enlisted specialists alike accepted roles that maximized efficiency. Calculations mattered as much as courage. Procedures mattered as much as bravery. By 1945, American artillery had achieved something unprecedented. It turned time into a weaponized variable. Detection technologies shrank uncertainty. Centralized computation eliminated hesitation. Synchronization magnified shock. Aerial observation ensured visibility. Together, these elements produced a battlefield environment in which traditional assumptions collapsed. For German gunners in June 1944, the realization came too late. They believed they possessed 15 minutes of safety. They had inherited doctrine forged in earlier victories. But warfare evolves unevenly. Sometimes the decisive breakthrough is not visible as a new machine or a larger gun. Sometimes it is procedural, hidden in training manuals, perfected in classrooms, rehearsed in quiet camps far from headlines. On the hills of Normandy, that procedural revolution proved lethal. Batteries that once survived by mobility were destroyed before displacement drills were complete. Counterattacks that once relied on speed were shattered before momentum formed. The stopwatch replaced the warning shot. In Okinawa, the enemy adapted by burrowing into the earth. In Germany, commanders tried to shorten exposure, yet neither could undo the fundamental shift. Reaction time had been compressed beyond traditional expectations. By the end of World War II, artillery was widely recognized by German prisoners as the most feared Allied weapon, not because it was new, not because it was larger, but because it arrived before they believed it could. The deadliest American weapon of the war was not a single piece of hardware. It was a system built on mathematics, communication, discipline, and relentless training. It was the ability to transform a gunshot into coordinates, coordinates into calculations, calculations into synchronized fire, all within minutes. When the German battery fired 12 rounds on June 15, 1944, they trusted experience, they trusted doctrine, they trusted the clock. What they did not realize was that somewhere, years earlier, that clock had already been rewritten.